that's the focal point. What's the first step?
So it used to be in the old days, you wrote a business plan, and a business plan is something you could kind of write in a library, right? It's, let's do a lot of market research and look for data and how big is this market and put together some PowerPoint slides. And by the way, let's have our quote financial plan. 5 years should say $100 million. I now tell my students that there's a secret Excel key code to auto-generate that. They're still looking for what those keys are. There's probably a lot of tech support calls into Microsoft, Daniel, just because of me. But in fact, what we now know is a plan is just a series of untested hypotheses. And I use this fancy word hypotheses because when I teach at Stanford, those students pay $50,000 a year and they need to tell their parents they learned something impressive at least once a week. But outside of Stanford, a startup really is a series of untested guesses. It's a big idea. A startup is nothing more than a faith-based enterprise on day one. It's faith. It's truly faith. And what your job is, another insight, is to turn that faith into fact as quickly as you can. So a startup, because it's an irrational decision. The odds are you're going to fail. But you do it because you're passionate, you're excited, etc. But the goal is to turn that passion and faith into facts as quickly as you can. And the organizing document I've adopted is not the business plan. It's something called the business model. And for the last 15 years, academics have argued, what the heck is a business model? You get two of us in a room and you come out with 9 definitions. But about 4 years ago, there was a guy in Switzerland, Alexander Osterwalder, who wrote a book called Business Model Generation. And all of you don't have all the business model pieces. But if you remember, I said the fancy word for that is you just have a series of untested hypotheses. The real insight we now have after 50 years in Silicon Valley is that there are no facts inside your building, so get the heck outside. It's a big idea. That is, there's no doubt that you might be the smartest person in your building, but it is in fact guaranteed that you are not as smart as collectively all your potential customers. But in fact, if you are an engineer, the default is thinking that maybe more code or more features will solve a talk to the customer problem. And some of you are actually like looking at your shoes being a little embarrassed right now. So the process we talk about to turn those hypotheses into facts is called customer development. And customer development says, we expect that your initial guesses, your initial hypotheses are more than likely wrong. And that's going to be okay. But we're going to get you out of the building physically or virtually, if you're a web mobile app, and we're going to have you start interacting with customers as early as possible. And you're going to test 2 fundamental assumptions. One is your assumption about what the problem or need the customer has. Because when you started this company, inside your head you were going, yeah, we're going to solve X problem for them. Or if it's an entertainment product, oh, we're going to fulfill this need. Great, let's see if someone other than you shared that belief. And if they did, now we're going to test the second piece, which is, does your solution solve that problem or need? That cannot be done inside your office. To answer your specific question, web, mobile, cloud apps allow us to get that feedback incredibly rapidly at a scale and at a speed never imagined. But the same process also works for physical products. It just means you physically need to get out of the building, kiss your family goodbye because you're not going to see them for a while, and then spend a lot of time talking to customers. But even if it's web mobile, I have a philosophy that says you haven't validated your hypotheses until you've seen potential customers' pupils dilate. Right? I have some serious technology who you would think they'd want to keep it all under wraps. One of the mistakes in thinking about this process assumes that what I want you to do is take your source code, your patents, and your firmware and share it with customers on day one. That's not what we're talking about at all. In fact, if we're doing that, we're doing way too much talking, and in fact, we're trying to sell something. My suggestion is we're not trying to sell anything at all. We're trying to do something that's very hard for an entrepreneur, and that's called listening, right? And that's called asking questions about what other people's needs are versus you trying to push. Look, I just invented this. Don't you think it's great? And how many will you buy? Rather than tell me about your problems, or gee, how do you solve them today? And so the customer development process is not about, how can I take all my IP and dump it on somebody's desk and say whether they like it. Is that?
Yeah, so this is the
Strategy in an early stage venture is by firing executives. Big idea. What we now understand is that startups actually go from failure to failure from day one.
Uh-huh.
And what we do is instead of firing executives, we fire the plan.
Uh-huh.
It's a huge idea.
That's
Remember
an
that business model
point.
canvas?
Yeah, it's a very interesting
What
point.
we do is we now iterate or pivot one or more of those components of the plan. Just one thought.
Yeah, go.
It might be that the customer segment was wrong.
Right.
It might be we picked the wrong channel. It might be the product feature fit with the customers were wrong. Product market fit were wrong. That is, we now just embrace that we're probably going to get this wrong a number of times on the march of finding the definition of a startup. So let me give you this, because It took me 33 years to get to this sentence. And that is, what is the definition of a startup? What is a startup? And I finally came up with something that explained it to me. A startup is a temporary organization designed to search for a scalable and repeatable business model. Now, if you just deconstruct that, a startup is a temporary organization. Too bad, because it's kind of fun to have your dog and free food and whatever. But the goal, right, is not to be a 10-year-old startup. In fact, there are no such things. There are 2-year-old startups attached to 8-year-old failures, but you're having a good time, right? Designed to search, right? If you think about it,
the dog's not a puppy anymore.
Right, the dog has puppies themselves. In fact, several generations of dogs. Designed to search. Your job is not to code or build product or even get customers. It's to search for something that's repeatable and scalable. We're looking for something that we could do the same day to day without special, magic stuff, and scales. You put $1 in, you get $3 out, right? And so what we're searching for is this business model, all the pieces. Now you have something to walk out of here with, which I know what I'm supposed to be doing.
But now you've got that.
Never get to see liquidity of their own company. Depending on investor or venture firm, most of them get blown out, or, which is a polite way to say, replaced by their VCs. And ironically, of course, the most successful tech companies were run by their founders. Some of them had to be exiled for a while till they grew up. Mm-hmm. But others, like Bill Gates and Larry Ellison and Reed Hastings and Dell, et cetera, still run it. But most everybody in between never got the secret memo. And here's the secret memo. A startup, to become a company, really goes through 3 phases. One is this search for the business model. Those are done by insanely crazy people, where chaos is the norm, right? You're searching for one thing on one day, you're going somewhere else on another, your strategy's here and here. By the way, founders who come from dysfunctional families actually have an edge here. That's only time in your life.
It's true.
Anybody, some of you are kind of quickly looking around, going, seeing if anybody notices, but I'm talking about you. It's the first time in your careers you're going to have an edge, because if you're a survivor of a dysfunctional family, you actually knew how to operate in chaos and focus on what's important. Mm-hmm. And by the way, as an aside, it's why you tend to crater your own company when it becomes successful, because when it becomes repeatable is when you get incredibly nervous and actually have to create. Sounds like you know exactly what I'm talking about. All right, so just as an aside, the next step.
It's that little voice.
It's that little voice. The next step is the one that you don't get the memo about. And here's the funny thing. If you're a venture-funded company, let's just say you're lucky enough to get venture capital, you see one VC, one venture capitalist every 6 weeks in a board meeting. What you don't understand is when they're pulling up in your parking lot for that board meeting, they have to look up your name. Because they're seeing they're on 10 to 12 boards. And if they're super angels, they might be invested in 50 or 100 companies. They don't even know what city you're in. They need GPS to figure out where your building is. But the day your company finds that repeatable business model, when you were thinking that you were going to announce in the boardroom, hey, we found profitability, et cetera, you were clearing the aisles and actually handing out confetti for the parade they were going to give you up and down the aisles. All of a sudden in that board meeting, the VCs are staring at you in a way that's making you personally uncomfortable. And the reason why is now all of a sudden, from a startup who was worth nothing, you are now incredibly valuable to them, and they are looking to see if you're the executive to take them to what's called liquidity, to take them to where they could actually take money out. And the odds are they're saying, he was crazy before, still crazy now. That isn't going to work. And they tend to look for operating execs. And an operating exec is someone who knows how to take a early stage venture and put in all the processes and procedures and the HR manual and the sales compensation plan and the whatever, where you were just happy, I don't know, here's the deal, whatever. Now, again, there are some world-class founders who manage to make that transition, but most don't. And by the way, some VCs are just happy to blow you out without a second thought. And while others actually are interested in career development for you, but none of them are ever going to tell you that when you're taking their money or they're giving you their money. Because if they said, oh, by the way, we're going to fire you, you'd go to the next firm, not understanding that every firm is looking out for their liquidity. Sure. It's almost criminal not to be collecting data and using it. But to me, the question is how and what are you looking for? And I tend to think of founders, world-class founders, are running a pattern recognizer full-time in the back of their heads. I just call it a neural net, and they're looking for patterns in the data. That is, this whole thing about customer development is I finally have figured out how to get founders outside the building. And then I realized, oh, I just got them standing in the parking lot. Okay, now I need to get them in front of customers. Okay, they're now, in front of customers. And for a while, I had them, reporting back about it every customer meeting, but not getting any insight. Mm-hmm. And what I realized was, it's why accountants don't run startups. And I apologize for any accountants in the room. But at the end of the day, this is not about a spreadsheet. Yeah. Right? A successful business in an early stage is not about adding the numbers or about the number of customers. It's about finding sometimes it's the outliers. It's the people who threw you out. Mm-hmm. And they said, too bad you don't have X, I would pay $1 million. And you kind of laugh, and then so you're driving the car going, did he just say $1 million? We're selling it for $600. Right. And then you go back and say, can I find some more of those people? Or, would you give me an order? And so, to me, analytics are just the beginning. Collecting this data is just the beginning, but it's not just to collect the data. You're looking for something that's just no one's kind of figured out. And this goes back to some of the successful patterns of entrepreneurs. People don't talk about pattern recognition. We talked about tenacious and we talked about agile, but boy, if you're not curious and if you're not great at patterns, the odds are you shouldn't be a founder. Join someone else's startup. Mm-hmm. Because it's not about execution based on numbers. There are some corner cases where you could find those, but I have found the most successful ones, they thought it was over here on day one, and they see some other pattern over here, and that's where the business is.
Yeah, I had personal experiences of that ilk, and it's absolutely the case that founders' vision tied to a particular moment in time or a particular product strategy can be blinded if you don't listen.
And what's really interesting is about when you get one of these flashes of recognition, most founders take about a week or two until they could connect it to their mouth, right? I mean, you go in and say, we need to change everything, but, well, why? It doesn't come out. It's not coming out of your mouth.
It's a belief system, and you're changing a belief system.
But somehow there's something connected in the back of your head that, at least if I'm on...
Audiences, all of this, in the modern world especially, factors in issues associated with, say, compliance, privacy, intellectual property, things like that. So do you have any general observations about intellectual property issues and things like that that people should be paying attention to? Because sometimes people think the patent is the product or what have you. So.
Yeah, I mean, I deal with some of the country's best scientists, NSF, National Science Foundation, and some of the other classes I teach in Stanford Engineering School and at Caltech. But the issue isn't about how smart you are or about your technology. The business is about how does your technology fit with customers who will pay a ton of money for it, and how can you find a lot of those? So, it's not just I have the best patent portfolio as a startup. That's different if you're Apple or Microsoft or Google or Facebook. But on day one, it's not just about your technology. And in fact, for most engineers, that's really a hard thing to get over, is because if it was just about about your technology, you're just going to need an extra room of where to put the bags of money when people show up at your door. Sure. And for some reason, it just doesn't happen that way. Yeah.
So what we're really people in the audience have a chance. So if anyone wants to start to queue around the microphones, I'd appreciate that.
At the club, our program tonight: how to